What if I told you the biggest decision in WNBA history didn't happen during a game, didn't happen at the draft, and didn't even happen on national television? It happened behind closed doors, in a boardroom. And when that decision was made, an entire generation of veterans quietly realized something terrifying. The league they helped build no longer belonged to them. This wasn't about one hard foul. It wasn't about trash talk. It wasn't even about Caitlin Clark. It was about money. It was about leverage. And it was about survival. Because the moment Caitlin Clark stepped into the WNBA, she didn't just bring fans. She didn't just bring ratings. She didn't just bring attention. She brought proof. Proof that the league could be something it had never been before, profitable. For 25 years, the WNBA operated on loyalty, on patience, on slow growth. Veterans carried the banner when arenas were half empty. They promoted the game when networks barely cared. They showed up when sponsorships were thin and charter flights were a luxury. They believed that when the breakthrough finally came, they would rise with it. But that's not what happened. Instead, when the numbers exploded, when the ratings spiked, when arenas started selling out, and when merchandise began flying off shelves, something shifted. And that shift wasn't emotional. It was mathematical. Executives looked at spreadsheets. Owners looked at projections. Networks looked at engagement data. And the conclusion they reached wasn't sentimental. It was cold. The future wasn't collective anymore. It had a face. And that face was 22 years old. Now here's the part most fans missed. The real power shift didn't happen when Caitlin hit her first deep three in the pros. It happened when executives realized something far more important. The league didn't need to convince people to care anymore. People already cared about her. And once that realization locked in, everything changed. The veterans thought this was about respect. The owners knew it was about revenue. And when those two things collided, only one was going to win. But to understand how the league quietly chose its future, you have to go back to the moment the numbers started rewriting the rules. Because what happened next wasn't gradual. It was immediate, and it was impossible to ignore. Before Caitlin Clark ever played a professional game, something unusual started happening. Tickets were disappearing. Not just selling, vanishing. Indiana Fever Games, a franchise that had struggled for years to fill seats, suddenly had waiting lists. Home attendance that once hovered around a few thousand began climbing so fast it felt unreal. Season ticket sales didn't just rise. They tripled. In a week. Road teams scrambled. Smaller arenas couldn't contain the demand when Clark came to town. Games were relocated. Upper decks that hadn't been opened in years suddenly had lights on again. And that was before she even proved herself at the professional level. That's when executives started paying attention. Because hype is one thing. Conversion is another. Then came the broadcast numbers. Her debut didn't quietly outperform expectations. It shattered them. Viewership spiked into the millions. Numbers the league hadn't consistently touched in years. Streaming subscriptions jumped. Social media engagement surged. Clips of her plays spread beyond sports pages into mainstream culture. But here's what made this different from previous spikes in attention. It wasn't temporary. Every game she played carried a measurable effect. When she was on the court, ratings climbed. When she sat, viewership dipped. Minute-by-minute tracking showed it clearly. Fans weren't watching the WNBA. They were watching Caitlin Clark. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Because for decades, the league positioned itself as a collective brand. The message was always about unity, about movement, about equality and shared growth. But data doesn't care about branding philosophy. Data only answers one question. What drives engagement? And the answer kept pointing to one name. Jersey sales told the same story. Within days, Clark merchandise wasn't just leading. It was outselling established veterans by margins that stunned insiders. Reports suggested her single-day jersey sales rivaled totals other players had accumulated across entire seasons. Sponsors noticed. Broadcasters noticed. Owners definitely noticed. And suddenly, conversations changed tone. Because for the first time in its history, the WNBA wasn't operating as a developmental brand supported by the NBA's financial safety net. It had something tangible, something monetizable, something scalable. Hope turned into projections. Projections turned into strategy. And strategy doesn't revolve around sentiment. It revolves around sustainability. Now here's where it became uncomfortable. Veterans had spent years fighting for better pay, better travel, better exposure. They argued, correctly, that the league deserved more respect. But when revenue finally surged, executives could trace the source. And it wasn't evenly distributed. It wasn't spread across the roster. It wasn't shared by legacy. It was concentrated in one player. For owners who had absorbed decades of financial losses, this wasn't just exciting. It was leverage. Because for years, negotiations between players and ownership were rooted in mutual dependency. The league needed its experienced stars. The players needed the league's survival. But now that balance tilted. If one athlete could independently drive millions in revenue, what did that mean for the old model? What did it mean for collective bargaining? What did it mean for salary demands? What did it mean for marketing budgets? The numbers didn't whisper the answer. They screamed it. The traditional hierarchy, built on tenure and championships, suddenly looked fragile. And that realization created tension. Because when value becomes measurable at that scale, status becomes secondary. Veterans saw the arenas filling. They saw social media exploding. They saw their own follower counts rising from proximity. But what they may not have fully realized at the time was this. Executives weren't celebrating the league. They were isolating the catalyst. And once that isolation happened, once the spreadsheets clearly showed where the revenue originated, loyalty stopped being a deciding factor. From that point forward, every boardroom conversation changed. It wasn't about honoring the past. It was about investing in the future. And the future, according to every metric available, had already chosen its centerpiece. But while executives were studying graphs and growth curves, players were reacting emotionally. And that reaction would shape everything that followed. Because the backlash didn't just create headlines. It created justification. And that's where the real shift began. The first signs weren't loud. They were subtle. A comment here. A podcast remark there. A veteran saying rookies needed to earn their place. On the surface, it sounded normal. Standard hierarchy talk. Every league has it. Veterans remind newcomers that the professional level is different. Faster. Stronger. Less forgiving. But this felt different. Because the rookie in question wasn't just another draft pick. She was walking in with a spotlight brighter than anyone the league had ever seen. And that spotlight created discomfort. Before Clark ever finished her first month in the league, interviews started circulating. Established stars were asked about her constantly. Media panels shifted focus toward her impact. Pre-game shows built narratives around her presence. For players who had carried the league through quiet years, it felt like being erased in real time. And that frustration started leaking. Some comments were framed as mentorship. Warnings about the physicality of the pro game. Reminders that college dominance doesn't automatically translate. But tone matters. And fans could feel it. There was an edge. Then the game started. And things got physical. Hard screens. Shoulder checks. Flagrant contact that didn't look accidental. Plays that, on replay, felt intentional. One particular moment went viral almost instantly. A hit so obvious it spread far beyond basketball circles. It wasn't just sports debate anymore. It was mainstream news. Clips replayed on national networks. Slow motion angles. Commentary dissecting intent. Suddenly, casual viewers who had never watched a WNBA game were talking about it. And they weren't debating defensive strategy. They were asking one simple question. Why does it look like they're trying to hurt her? That question changed everything. Because perception drives narrative. And narrative drives business. From that moment forward, it wasn't just about competition. It became a storyline. Veterans weren't seen as defending standards. They were seen as gatekeeping. Whether that interpretation was fair or not didn't matter. It stuck. Social media amplified every moment. Every hard foul became evidence. Every sarcastic comment became proof. Every subtle slight became fuel. The more Clark endured, the more fans rallied. And something unexpected happened. Instead of shrinking under pressure, her brand expanded. Clips of her getting knocked down and calmly getting back up became symbolic. She didn't respond with public attacks. She didn't escalate the drama. She played. And the contrast was powerful. On one side, visible frustration. On the other, quiet focus. Executives were watching this play out in real time. Because controversy can be damaging. But it can also be profitable. Engagement spiked whenever Clark was involved in a heated moment. Social discussion increased. Highlight clips trended. Broadcast segments dissected interactions for days. Even criticism translated into clicks. And clicks translate into ad revenue. This is the part many didn't understand. The backlash wasn't shrinking her value. It was increasing it. The more resistance she faced, the more invested viewers became. It created a hero versus establishment narrative, whether intentionally or not. And in modern sports media, narratives sell. But here's where it turned strategic. The veterans believed they were protecting the league's competitive integrity, reminding everyone that professional respect is earned. What they didn't realize was that every public challenge reinforced her centrality. Every time someone criticized the coverage she received, it confirmed that coverage existed. Every time someone minimized her, it pushed her name back into headlines. Every time someone tried to put her in her place, they elevated her visibility. It became a cycle. Pushback, attention, ratings, revenue, influence. And influence is what ultimately shifts power. Inside locker rooms, tension reportedly grew. Not necessarily open hostility, but discomfort. Some players welcomed the surge in attention. Others worried about the imbalance. Because the league had always prided itself on collective recognition. Now one player was absorbing the spotlight. And that spotlight was getting hotter. Media narratives intensified. Commentators debated whether coverage was disproportionate. Analysts discussed whether attention was rooted in performance or marketability. Broader cultural conversations entered the picture. The situation became layered, complicated, and while debates raged publicly, something quieter was happening privately. Network executives were analyzing behavior. They weren't just tracking ratings. They were tracking sentiment. Which players leaned into the moment? Which players resisted it? Which ones boosted engagement positively? Which ones triggered backlash? Because from a corporate perspective, image matters as much as performance. And when tensions escalated publicly, it gave decision-makers clarity. This wasn't just a basketball adjustment period. It was a branding shift. The old guard had assumed their legacy granted permanent influence. But influence in professional sports isn't guaranteed by tenure. It's determined by traction. And traction was flowing overwhelmingly in one direction. Now here's the irony. Many veterans had spent years fighting for better media coverage. More attention. More marketing investment. Clark's arrival delivered exactly that. But because the distribution wasn't equal, it didn't feel like progress. It felt like displacement. And that emotional reaction, completely human, completely understandable, created the perception of division. Once that perception set in, executives had justification. They could say they weren't choosing sides. They were responding to audience behavior. They weren't promoting conflict. They were capitalizing on demand. And that distinction protected them. Because if the backlash hadn't happened, if veterans had embraced the surge openly, if the narrative had been unity instead of friction, the boardroom conversation might have looked different. But once public tension became part of the storyline, it made the pivot easier. It made the investment safer. It made the decision defensible. And that decision would soon become visible in a way no one could ignore. Because while players were battling on the court, NBC was preparing something far bigger off it. And when that move became public, it didn't just confirm a shift. It finalized it. The public debate was loud, but the real decision was silent. While fans argued online and players exchanged subtle jabs through interviews, executives were reviewing something far more powerful than opinion. They were reviewing contracts. In February 2025, NBC announced a massive new media rights deal involving both the NBA and the WNBA. The numbers were staggering. Billions tied to long-term broadcast strategy, streaming expansion, digital distribution, cross-platform promotion. For the WNBA, this was historic. For decades, the league had fought for consistent network commitment. Games were often scheduled in less desirable time slots. Promotion felt secondary. Coverage was limited. Now, suddenly, the platform was enormous. But the real story wasn't the deal itself. It was what NBC did next. Instead of building its WNBA rollout around established champions, the decorated veterans, the Olympic gold medalists, the multi-time title holders, NBC centered its promotional campaign around one player, Caitlin Clark. She wasn't just featured. She was positioned, placed alongside NBA legends, seated courtside at marquee events, brought into crossover segments where she analyzed NBA games with household names. That decision sent a message, and it wasn't subtle, because NBC didn't need to make that choice. They had options. They could have balanced coverage, rotated spotlights, honored legacy while promoting growth. But when they tested promotional materials internally, the results weren't close. Posters featuring established veterans generated modest engagement. Clips featuring Clark generated explosive response. Social media ads featuring her reportedly multiplied interaction metrics several times over. Click-through rates jumped. Shares increased. Casual viewers, the audience networks desperately want, recognized her instantly. Recognition is currency. And NBC had just invested billions. This wasn't about fairness. It was about return on investment. Inside corporate offices, emotion doesn't factor into multi-million-dollar strategy. Data does. And the data was clear. When Clark appeared on screen, audiences stayed. When she didn't, viewership dropped. Minute-by-minute analytics confirmed it. Segments with her involvement spiked retention. Streaming numbers on Peacock mirrored the pattern. This created a hard truth. The league's collective branding model, built on shared visibility, didn't align with modern engagement metrics. The audience wasn't consuming the league as a whole. They were consuming a personality. Once NBC internalized that, the marketing machine adjusted. Commercials highlighted her highlights. Digital campaigns used her name as the lead. Crossovers with NBA programming placed her in spaces previously reserved for long-established stars. And in doing so, NBC did something subtle but powerful. They separated her brand from the league's limitations. She wasn't just a WNBA player. She was a basketball personality, a mainstream sports figure. That distinction matters, because when a player's brand grows beyond the league itself, leverage shifts. Veterans who had spent years trying to elevate the league now watched as a rookie transcended it in one season. To some, it felt like erasure. To executives, it felt like evolution. Now here's where things became irreversible. Once NBC publicly aligned its marketing power behind Clark, the perception of hierarchy solidified. Fans noticed who appeared in commercials, who appeared in graphics, who was missing. Promotional materials rarely spotlighted the same veterans who had defined the league's previous decade. Whether intentional or not, absence communicates. And that absence fueled speculation. Were veterans being sidelined? Were networks choosing profitability over loyalty? Were decades of foundational effort being quietly replaced? Publicly, NBC framed everything as growth, excitement, new energy. Privately, the calculus was simpler. They had invested heavily. They needed a reliable return. And one player was proving to be the safest bet. The veterans were furious. Not necessarily because Clark was succeeding, but because the scale of her platform dwarfed theirs overnight. Players who had built resumes over 10 seasons found themselves competing for airtime with someone who had just arrived. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. And that speed made it sting. But here's the uncomfortable reality. NBC wasn't punishing veterans. They were responding to consumer behavior. When audiences repeatedly signal preference through clicks, views, and purchases, corporations listen. The problem wasn't that veterans lacked talent. The problem was that talent alone wasn't driving numbers. Clark represented something broader, a crossover appeal that extended beyond core basketball audiences. She attracted casual viewers, new demographics, fans who hadn't tuned in before. From a business perspective, that's expansion. Expansion justifies investment. Investment determines exposure. And exposure determines influence. By the time the promotional wave fully launched, the power shift wasn't theoretical anymore. It was visible. On billboards. In commercials. Across broadcast panels. The league hadn't officially declared a new era. But the network had. And when the platform chooses a centerpiece, the ecosystem adjusts around it. The veterans were still negotiating contracts. Still pushing for better revenue share. Still advocating for travel improvements and salary increases. But the media partner funding much of the league's growth had already indicated where its confidence lay. And that changed everything. Because when you're in the middle of a labor dispute, leverage is everything. And leverage depends on necessity. If networks and sponsors believe the product survives, or even thrives, without certain players, negotiation strength weakens. That's the part no one wanted to say out loud. But boardrooms were whispering it. What if the league's future doesn't require the entire old structure? What if rebuilding around youth is more profitable? What if the audience is attached to a person, not a roster? Those questions didn't need public answers. They only needed private consideration. And once they were considered, the tone of negotiations shifted. Because the billion-dollar deal didn't just fund the league. It redefined who the league revolved around. But this wasn't just a media story. It was about labor. It was about money. And it was about who actually holds power when revenue finally starts flowing. And that's where the next battle began. For years, the WNBA Players Association had been preparing for this moment. Higher salaries, better travel conditions, revenue share increases, long-term guarantees. These weren't radical demands. Compared to other professional leagues, they were modest. Players wanted stability, respect, a bigger slice of a growing pie. And historically, they had leverage. Because without the players, there is no league. That's how labor negotiations work. But something had changed. Quietly. Before Caitlin Clark entered the league, the WNBA had reportedly operated at a loss for most of its existence. The NBA subsidized operations. Owners absorbed financial hits year after year, hoping for gradual growth. The business model was fragile. Everyone knew it. Then the numbers shifted. Ticket sales surged. Sponsorship interest climbed. Broadcast partners committed long-term. Merchandise revenue spiked. Streaming subscriptions saw noticeable bumps during games she played. For the first time, profitability didn't feel hypothetical. It felt possible. And that possibility altered negotiation psychology. When the union pushed for a larger revenue share, owners did what owners always do. They ran the math. If overall league revenue increases because of one player's drawing power, how should that revenue be distributed? Collectively? Or strategically? That's where things got complicated. Because the WNBA was built on shared growth, shared branding, shared advancement. But revenue spikes weren't evenly distributed. They were concentrated around certain games, certain matchups, certain appearances. Owners noticed a pattern. Games featuring Clark consistently outperformed those without her. Viewership numbers dropped sharply when she wasn't playing. Merchandise revenue centered heavily around her name. This created an uncomfortable reality. If a strike occurred, if veterans sat out demanding higher pay, would audiences completely disappear? That question used to have a simple answer. Yes. But now, not necessarily. Because if fans were tuning in primarily for one or two rising stars, the product didn't vanish entirely without established veterans. That possibility weakened the union's strongest weapon. In most professional sports, collective action is devastating. Canceled games cost millions. Networks panic. Sponsors pressure ownership. But if ownership believes the audience remains engaged through emerging stars, the threat softens. And that's where the tone reportedly shifted behind closed doors. Owners began discussing sustainability models centered around youth pipelines. Draft prospects generating buzz. College stars with existing followings. Players entering the league already carrying national attention. If marketability starts before a rookie signs a contract, owners gain flexibility. That flexibility changes bargaining power. Now, none of this was announced publicly. Official statements remained respectful, collaborative, focused on shared growth. But insiders hinted at tension. Some players reportedly questioned whether pushing too aggressively risked unintended consequences. Because if negotiations broke down and a season was threatened, who stood to lose more? Veterans relying on salary and endorsement visibility? Or a rising star already building media presence beyond the league? Clark's situation complicated everything. She had endorsements. She had network relationships. She had national exposure separate from league games. If a season stalled, her relevance wouldn't disappear. But for many veterans, league visibility was central to maintaining endorsement value. That disparity created quiet concern. Because labor unity depends on aligned incentives. And suddenly, incentives weren't identical. Owners recognized that dynamic. If negotiations collapsed, they could potentially rebuild around youth. Promote a new wave. Market the league differently. Was it risky? Absolutely. But for the first time in league history, risk felt less frightening than stagnation. That's the part few people discussed publicly. Before Clark, losing a season could cripple the league. After Clark, ownership may have believed they could survive it if the right pieces remained. This doesn't mean owners wanted a confrontation. It means their fear threshold changed. And in negotiations, fear often determines compromise. The union's demands were rooted in long-standing frustration. But leverage depends on irreplaceability. And when executives began believing certain players were more irreplaceable than others, the structure tilted. Veterans who once anchored bargaining strength now faced a new reality. Their value was being measured differently. Not by championships, not by tenure, by engagement metrics, by conversion rates, by audience retention. It's a brutal way to evaluate athletes, but it's how media-driven sports operate in 2025. This is where the emotional narrative collided with corporate logic. Veterans saw their fight as overdue justice. Owners saw an opportunity to restructure sustainably. The two perspectives weren't aligned. And when alignment disappears in labor talks, tension escalates quickly. Behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. What if the league pivoted hard toward the next generation? What if salaries were structured differently based on market impact? What if revenue share wasn't distributed evenly but tied to measurable draw? Those ideas weren't official policy, but even considering them signaled a philosophical shift. The WNBA had long resisted superstar-centric economics. Now data was pushing them toward it. And data doesn't negotiate emotionally. It negotiates pragmatically. The veterans felt the ground shifting. Some reportedly urged caution within union discussions. Others doubled down, believing ownership bluffing. But the difference between 2019 and 2025 was stark. In 2019, a strike threat carried existential weight. In 2025, ownership had something they'd never had before. Confidence. Confidence that audiences would follow specific stars regardless of collective disruption. And once ownership gains confidence, compromise becomes slower, harder, more calculated. This was no longer just a labor dispute. It was a referendum on the league's identity. Collective equality versus star-driven capitalism. Shared growth versus concentrated investment. And as negotiations continued, corporate America began sending signals of its own. Because brands don't wait for disputes to resolve. They align with momentum. And the momentum was obvious. Which brings us to the next shift. One that happened quietly, but spoke volumes. Brands don't argue. They don't debate legacy. They don't care who built the foundation. They care about conversion. And in 2025, conversion was pointing in one direction. For years, endorsement money in the WNBA was steady but limited. A few stars secured shoe deals. Some landed insurance commercials. Others partnered with niche lifestyle brands. It was respectable, but not explosive. Then Clark entered the equation, and corporate tracking systems lit up. Every post she made generated massive interaction. Every highlight clip translated into merchandise clicks. Every televised appearance carried measurable spikes in online traffic. Brands monitor these things obsessively. Engagement rates, click-through percentages, audience demographics, retention curves. And when her name appeared in the data, patterns emerged quickly. She wasn't just popular. She was scalable. That word matters. Scalable means growth potential beyond the current audience. It means expansion into new markets. It means the ability to sell not just to core fans, but to casual viewers, youth demographics, crossover sports audiences. Nike faced a delicate position. They had relationships with established veterans. They had invested in women's basketball long before the surge. Loyalty matters in long-term brand strategy. But brand strategy also responds to momentum. Clark's signature shoe buzz reportedly began building before official releases. Pre-orders hinted at demand levels rarely seen in women's basketball. Other companies didn't hesitate. Insurance brands, sports drink companies, equipment manufacturers. They leaned in, hard, because the math was simple. When Clark appeared in a campaign, engagement multiplied. When veterans appeared, engagement stabilized, but didn't spike. In the attention economy, spikes matter. Peacock subscriptions reportedly rose noticeably during key matchups she played in. Streaming retention followed her appearances. Social media trending cycles aligned with her schedule. Corporate America saw something rare. A female athlete generating crossover interest at scale. That's not just valuable. It's strategic. But this alignment had consequences. Endorsement budgets are finite. When more money flows toward one personality, less remains for others. Veterans who had enjoyed steady brand relationships began noticing shifts. Campaign renewals slowed. New offers felt smaller. Marketing emphasis adjusted. This wasn't personal. It was resource allocation. And corporations are ruthless with allocation. They invest where growth compounds. Clark's demographic reach extended into younger audiences. College fans followed her. NBA fans recognized her. Casual sports viewers clicked her highlights even if they rarely watched full games. That multi-layered appeal is gold to advertisers. And once advertisers move, media partners follow. Because sponsorship drives broadcast revenue. Broadcast revenue drives league economics. League economics drive negotiation leverage. Everything connects. Now here's where it became undeniable. Brands started building campaigns around her presence specifically, not just women's basketball broadly. That distinction changed perception. It signaled that corporations weren't investing in the league equally. They were investing in the individual driving measurable return. Veterans felt sidelined. Some publicly voiced concerns about unequal coverage. Others remained quiet, but reportedly expressed frustration privately. Because from their perspective, they had endured the lean years. They had promoted the league when national attention was scarce. Now, during the breakthrough, the spotlight bypassed them. But corporate America doesn't operate on seniority. It operates on projection. And projections indicated sustained growth centered on Clark's brand. The more brands leaned in, the more separation occurred. She began appearing in spaces beyond the WNBA context. NBA broadcasts, crossover sports panels, mainstream media segments. Her identity shifted from league player to basketball personality. That matters. Because when a player's relevance transcends the league itself, her economic independence increases. And independence shifts leverage. If a labor dispute intensifies, if negotiations stall, if a season faces disruption, a player with multi-platform brand integration remains visible. Others may not. That reality introduced quiet tension. Because collective bargaining depends on shared vulnerability. When vulnerability isn't shared equally, unity strains. Brands weren't making moral judgments. They weren't taking sides in locker room debates. They were optimizing exposure. And exposure increasingly centered around one name. Even subtle marketing decisions reinforced the hierarchy. Placement in digital banners. Feature priority in highlight compilations. Positioning in promotional graphics. Absence is often louder than presence. Veterans noticed when they weren't included. Fans noticed too. Speculation grew. Was this the league evolving naturally? Or was it being restructured by external economic forces? The answer may have been both. Corporate alignment accelerated what media analytics had already indicated. The WNBA was no longer operating under slow collective growth. It was operating under star-driven capitalism. And once capitalism defines the ecosystem, sentiment loses influence. This doesn't mean veterans lacked value. It means value was being recalibrated. In boardrooms, value equals draw. Draw equals revenue. Revenue equals power. And power had begun consolidating. But here's the uncomfortable twist. Building everything around one star carries risk. Massive risk. Injury risk. Burnout risk. Public perception risk. Overexposure risk. If that star falters, the system built around her trembles. Corporate America was betting she wouldn't. Owners were betting she wouldn't. Networks were betting she wouldn't. And that bet reshaped the league faster than anyone anticipated. But while executives doubled down, something else was happening quietly. Private meetings, contingency planning, strategic modeling. Because if this transformation continued, the next phase wouldn't be about endorsement deals. It would be about structural change. And that possibility made even confident veterans uneasy. By early 2025, something felt different behind the scenes. Not dramatic, not explosive, but deliberate. Owners weren't panicking anymore. That alone was unusual. For years, financial reports around the league carried a tone of caution. Investment required patience. Growth was incremental. Sustainability depended on careful balance. Now suddenly, projections looked aggressive, optimistic, even bold. And when optimism enters ownership meetings, long-term planning shifts. Quietly, contingency models were reportedly being explored. What would a youth-centered league look like? What if marketing fully embraced the new generation? What if salary structures were recalibrated around measurable market impact? What if the league leaned all the way into star-driven economics instead of resisting it? None of this was officially confirmed. But speculation grew because the incentives had changed. The draft pipeline was strong. College basketball was producing players with massive built-in followings. Social media presence before signing a pro contract. Nil-era visibility meant rookies arrived already monetizable. That changes risk assessment. If a veteran retires or departs, historically viewership dips. But if a rookie enters with millions of followers and national recognition, that dip can be offset. That possibility made ownership less dependent on tenure. And dependence determines leverage. The labor negotiations still hovered in the background. Revenue share debates, travel upgrades, contract guarantees. But if ownership believes it can survive short-term disruption by accelerating a youth movement, urgency fades. That's the subtle shift veterans began sensing. Because for decades, experience equaled stability. Now youth equaled upside. And upside attracts investment. There were whispers about replacement player scenarios, not as an immediate plan, but as a negotiating fallback. Historically, that idea would have been laughable. A WNBA season without its established stars would have been commercially dangerous. But now, if Clark remained active, if emerging prospects filled out rosters, if media coverage stayed strong, would audiences completely disappear? Ownership didn't need a perfect season. They needed survivability. And survivability felt more attainable than ever. This wasn't about punishing veterans. It was about structural flexibility. If a league is no longer operating at consistent losses, the calculus shifts. Loyalty matters less than sustainability. Now here's the uncomfortable reality. Some veterans reportedly began reconsidering their posture internally. Not publicly, but privately. Because when the economic environment changes, strategy must adapt. If the league's growth trajectory truly centered around a new generation, resisting that shift could isolate them further. It became less about fighting for equal spotlight, and more about ensuring relevance within a new ecosystem. That's a hard adjustment for any professional athlete, especially those who carried the weight of growth for years. Imagine building a house brick by brick, then watching someone arrive just as the property value explodes, and suddenly they're considered the most important piece of the structure. Emotionally, that's difficult. Strategically, it's irrelevant. Because in professional sports, timing can outweigh tenure. Ownership wasn't necessarily eager to sever ties with veterans, but they were no longer fearful of doing so if necessary. That difference changed the atmosphere. The idea of a reset stopped sounding extreme. It started sounding feasible. A league structured around emerging stars. Contracts aligned with measurable draw. Marketing campaigns centered unapologetically around personalities who convert audiences. Is it risky? Absolutely. Star-centric systems are fragile. An injury can destabilize everything. Overexposure can trigger fatigue. Public controversy can reverse momentum. But ownership calculated that stagnation was riskier. Returning to half-empty arenas and flat ratings wasn't acceptable anymore. And once that decision crystallizes, once growth becomes non-negotiable, legacy stops protecting anyone. Veterans weren't officially abandoned, but they weren't untouchable anymore either. That's the shift. For the first time in league history, being foundational didn't guarantee being central. Being profitable did. And profitability had a name. But here's where the story deepens. Because restructuring around one superstar creates a dangerous dependency. And even executives understood that. The question wasn't just whether the league could move forward without certain veterans. The question was whether it could survive if its new centerpiece faltered. And that risk might be the most important part of this entire transformation. There's a reason most professional leagues avoid building everything around one player. It's not because they don't want superstars. It's because dependency is fragile. And right now, whether anyone wants to admit it or not, the WNBA is walking directly into that risk. For the first time in its history, the league's growth curve is heavily concentrated around a single personality. Broadcast schedules are shaped around her matchups. Marketing campaigns revolve around her highlights. Streaming platforms measure engagement based on her minutes played. Sponsors calculate return on investment using her social media metrics. That level of centralization can generate explosive short-term growth. But long-term, it's volatile. Because what happens if she gets hurt? We've already seen moments where an awkward landing or a slight limp sparks panic across social media. Every replay freezes the screen. Every slow-motion angle gets dissected. Not just because fans care, but because the league's financial projection now hinges on her availability. That's pressure. Massive pressure. No other player in league history has carried this kind of economic weight so early in their career. And that weight isn't just about basketball performance. It's about narrative continuity. As long as she plays, the story moves forward. As long as the story moves forward, ratings remain elevated. As long as ratings remain elevated, sponsorships stay committed. Break that chain, even temporarily, and the ripple effect is real. This is the gamble ownership accepted. They chose acceleration over insulation. They chose growth spikes over balanced stability. Because returning to the old model, slower expansion, distributed spotlight, didn't offer the same financial breakthrough. But centralized growth means centralized vulnerability. If Clark ever decided to take a break, play overseas, or shift focus toward broader media ventures, the league would feel it immediately. Because the brand equity now stretches beyond the WNBA itself. She's appearing in NBA conversations, mainstream sports panels, national commercials. Her identity is no longer confined to one league. That independence strengthens her leverage, but it weakens structural balance. And executives know this, which is why the strategy appears twofold. Promote her heavily, but also accelerate the pipeline. Elevate other young stars alongside her. Create a class, not just a centerpiece. Because if the league can build 3 or 4 marketable figures simultaneously, risk spreads. Right now, though, concentration remains obvious. Minute-by-minute analytics still show viewership spikes tied directly to her presence. Social media trends align disproportionately with her performances. Merchandise sales tilt heavily in her direction. That's not inherently negative. It's powerful. But power without distribution becomes fragile. Veterans see this risk clearly. Some argue that leaning too heavily on one personality undermines the league's collective foundation. They may be right. Because what sustained the WNBA for decades wasn't individual superstardom. It was cohesion, shared identity, resilience. Now the identity feels more singular, and singular systems demand protection. The league must protect her health, protect her brand, protect her narrative. Because if controversy overwhelms performance, if fatigue sets in, if public sentiment shifts, the financial arc could wobble. And this is where things get complex. Clark didn't ask to become the economic engine. She performed. She attracted attention. She converted audiences. The ecosystem responded. But ecosystems sometimes overcorrect. And that overcorrection creates structural imbalance. Ownership believes the upside outweighs the risk. Sponsors believe the brand trajectory remains upward. Networks believe the ratings justify the focus. But professional sports history is filled with cautionary tales about over-reliance. Injuries happen. Public narratives change. Fan attention shifts. That's why leagues usually cultivate depth. Right now, the WNBA is racing to build that depth quickly enough to stabilize growth. Rookies entering the draft are already being positioned as future faces. Social media campaigns are expanding to highlight younger players. The strategy appears intentional: diversify attention without diluting the centerpiece. It's a delicate balance. Too much diversification, and you lose the explosive spike. Too little, and you increase vulnerability. The veterans understand something else too. Even if they were sidelined in the short-term spotlight, they represent institutional knowledge, playoff experience, championship pedigree. Those qualities anchor credibility. If the league transitions too abruptly into pure marketability, it risks alienating core fans who value competition first. So the gamble isn't just financial. It's philosophical. Is the WNBA a collective movement built on shared growth? Or is it evolving into a star-driven entertainment product optimized for modern media cycles? The answer may determine its next decade. Right now, executives are betting that personality-driven growth will expand the entire ecosystem. They're betting that today's spike becomes tomorrow's baseline. But betting carries risk, and risk defines eras. If this gamble succeeds, the WNBA enters a new economic tier. If it fails, critics will argue the foundation was sacrificed for momentum. Either way, the transformation is already underway. And it's bigger than one player. Because what's happening here isn't isolated to women's basketball. It's a preview of how modern sports leagues may operate moving forward. Which brings us to the final layer. The part that reaches beyond contracts, beyond endorsements, beyond locker room tension. The part that defines what this era actually means. Step back for a second. Forget the fouls. Forget the interviews. Forget the social media arguments. Look at the pattern. A league that operated for decades on gradual growth suddenly experiences a surge so dramatic it forces structural change. Not cosmetic change. Foundational change. And it all centers around one uncomfortable truth. Modern sports isn't built on participation. It's built on attention. Attention is currency. And whoever controls attention controls leverage. For years, the WNBA fought for visibility. Players advocated for coverage. They demanded primetime slots. They pushed for better marketing budgets. Now visibility isn't the problem. Distribution is. Because the attention didn't spread evenly. It concentrated. And that concentration forced the league to evolve faster than anyone expected. Young players watching this unfold are learning something critical. Talent gets you drafted. Marketability builds empires. The next generation won't just train on the court. They'll train online. Brand building will begin before signing a contract. College stars will enter the league already monetized. And owners will prioritize players who convert audiences immediately. That changes everything. It means endorsement potential will influence draft buzz. It means social media engagement could quietly affect contract negotiations. It means personality and performance are now intertwined at a structural level. This is no longer just a basketball league trying to survive. It's an entertainment product competing in a saturated digital world. And the rules of that world are unforgiving. If you trend, you grow. If you don't, you disappear. Veterans represent an era where resilience sustained the league. Clark represents an era where virality accelerates it. Neither approach is wrong, but they operate under different economic realities. The veterans built stability. The new wave is building scale. The question isn't who deserved the spotlight more. The question is whether the league can merge both eras without fracturing. Because cultural tension doesn't vanish overnight. Fans have chosen sides. Comment sections reflect it. Some argue the league finally has a mainstream superstar and should embrace it fully. Others argue that reducing the league's identity to one name undermines decades of collective effort. Both perspectives contain truth. But business momentum rarely waits for consensus. It moves. And right now, momentum is unmistakable. What we're witnessing isn't just internal conflict. It's the evolution of a business model. From subsidy-supported growth, to data-driven expansion, from shared visibility, to algorithm-optimized promotion, from legacy-based influence, to engagement-based power. That shift will define the next 10 years. If the league manages it carefully, cultivating multiple stars, balancing marketing exposure, maintaining competitive integrity, it could reach levels of profitability never imagined before. If it mishandles the transition, leaning too heavily into one personality while alienating foundational supporters, volatility could follow. But one thing is certain. The era of slow, patient, incremental growth is over. The WNBA is now in the spotlight whether it's comfortable there or not. And spotlights expose everything. Locker room dynamics, negotiation strategies, corporate alliances, personal branding gaps. Nothing hides in high visibility. The veterans may feel abandoned. Executives may feel justified. Fans may feel divided. But history rarely pauses for comfort. It moves with whoever captures attention. And right now, attention has a clear gravitational center. The real story isn't that one player rose. It's that the league decided to orbit. That decision may define modern women's sports economics for the next generation. Because if this works, other leagues will follow. If this fails, they'll study it as a cautionary tale. Either way, we're watching a turning point. Not just for one franchise, not just for one athlete, but for how professional women's sports positions itself in a media-first world. And whether you agree with the shift or not, you can't ignore it, because it's happening in real time. There was no official announcement declaring a new era. No press conference saying veterans were being replaced. No dramatic firing. No public exile. Just contracts. Just campaigns. Just analytics. And slow, deliberate decisions made in rooms most fans will never see. The veterans believed they were protecting the culture. Executives believed they were protecting the future. Both thought they were right. But in professional sports, survival often decides the winner. The league didn't choose sides emotionally. It followed momentum. And momentum doesn't wait for tradition. Now the real question is this. Will this new era elevate everyone? Or will it prove that betting everything on one star was the biggest gamble of all? We're about to find out. If you want breakdowns that go beyond the headlines, the business moves, the power shifts, the decisions happening behind closed doors, make sure you subscribe. Because the surface story is never the real story. And this transformation? It's just getting started.